what I'm going to show you is that there's 5 different ways that if you can prove certain combination of angles and sides, that you may not be showing that all 3 angles and all 3 sides are congruent, but if you can show a combination of sides and angles that are congruent, you are therefore proving that the entire triangle are congruent to each other. So the first one is side, side, side. And what side, 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 side means is if you've got these 2 sides are congruent, these 2 sides are congruent, and these 2 sides are congruent, because those 3 sides are congruent, the entire triangle is congruent, meaning that therefore the angles are congruent to each other. Okay, so if you can show that 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to 3 sides of the other triangle, by side, 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 the 2 triangles are congruent to each other. The next one is side, angle, side. And what that one is showing is that if you can show that 2 sides are congruent to each other, so one side, 2 sides, and that the angle between them is congruent. Notice that there's an A in between here, side, angle, side, and it has to be in the included angle, that these 2 triangles are congruent. I don't need any other information. I know automatically by side, angle, side that these 2 triangles are congruent. So without any other information, I know that this side is congruent to this side, this angle is congruent to this angle, and this angle is congruent to this angle. So all I need is the part in green to prove that the 2 triangles are congruent. I can therefore then assume or know that the parts in blue are also congruent. Okay, that's side, angle, side. So then we have angle, side, angle. And so here we've got congruent angles here. I've got congruent angles here. And then if the side between them is the same, that's why the S is in the middle for angle, side, angle, ASA, these 2 triangles are congruent. So again, if I can show that 2 angles are congruent and the side between them is congruent, I don't need any other information. I automatically know that these 2 triangles are congruent to each other. Then we have angle, angle, side. And so this is saying the same idea in that, sorry, these 2 angles are congruent, these 2 angles are congruent, but a side that is not included between the 2 angles. So notice I'm not picking the side that's between the 2 angles. It's a side that's outside the angles. So if I can show that 2 angles and a corresponding side are congruent to each other, I have shown by angle, angle, side that the 2 triangles are congruent. I don't even need to know anything else about the other angles or the other sides. So that's angle, angle, side. Then the last one is hypotenuse, leg. Hypotenuse is a term that is specific to right triangles. So if this is a right angle, the side opposite is the hypotenuse. All right, so I've got a right triangle here. So if I can show that the 2 hypotenuses are congruent and corresponding legs, meaning either these 2 legs or these 2 legs. It has to be the corresponding legs. If I can show that they are congruent by hypotenuse, leg, I have shown that the 2 triangles are congruent without having any other information about the angles or about the other sides right here. Okay? So those are the 5 different ways that you can show triangles are congruent. So let's do a couple of proofs, excuse me, where we are practicing this, okay? So these are 2 proofs. They're from your textbook. And so let's look at this. So the first thing is that AB is parallel to CD. This is one of the givens right here. AB is parallel to CD, and it is marked with the arrows. The arrows are the notation that marks, that shows that the 2 lines are parallel. So that is given. All right, then it says that angle ABE is congruent to angle CDE, and that angle BAE is congruent to angle DCE. So let's look at what that means. Angle ABE is congruent to angle CDE. That's this one right here. Well, do you notice that because you've got parallel lines, these are alternate interior angles? So I'm going to give you guys a hint. Anytime you're given lines or told that lines are parallel like you are here, it's going to have something to do with alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles, same side interior or same side exterior. That's why they're telling you that the lines are parallel, because there's some sort of relationship between the angles. So these lines are, or these angles are congruent. So therefore, that's alternate interior angles. And so again, just to refresh your memory on this, because I know it's been a little bit, if you have a pair of parallel lines that are intersected by a transversal, you have alternate interior angles that are congruent. So that's what this is showing here, only you've got it in the shape of a quadrilateral, but it's still the same idea. All right, so I showed this one, but now let me show you this one. So angle BAE is congruent to angle DCE, which is this one here. That's alternate interior angles as well. All right, now just to step back for a second, what we're trying to do here is we are trying to prove that these two triangles, we're trying to prove that this triangle is congruent to this triangle here. So just remember that's the ultimate goal here. So we want to prove it in some way using one of the 5 things that we've talked about today, that I've showed you: the side, 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 side angle, side, HL, and so on. Okay, so excuse me. So we've got that E is the midpoint of AC and BD. That is given. E is the midpoint of AC and BD. So that's given. Now, because that's the midpoint, that tells us that, that this segment is congruent to this segment. That is definition of midpoint. So let me write that down. So I'm going to say line segment DE is congruent to line segment BE. And that's definition of midpoint. But do you notice that it also said that it's for AC and BD? So that means that this line segment is congruent to this line segment here. So, so let's write that down. So then we've got that line segment CE is congruent to line segment AE. So it's definition of midpoint that said this, okay? And so then we have that angle AEB is congruent, excuse me, to angle CED. So AEB is congruent to angle CEB. That is vertical angles because they're directly across from each other. Again, when you've got angles directly across from each other like this, they're vertical angles and they are congruent. They have the same angle measure. So here we have actually proven all 3 sides and all 3 angles are congruent. So because of that, these 2 triangles are congruent to each other by definition of congruent angles. Now, I'm going to go backwards a little bit. I'm not going to erase the proof, but I'm going to erase my drawing just to show you that we maybe didn't need to go quite that far. And here's what I mean. So I'll mark up what we do in blue, okay? So it's given that they were parallel, excuse me, and we figured out that this angle is congruent to this angle, and then we figured out that this angle was congruent to this angle, okay? And then when we found out that E was the midpoint, we found out that these 2 segments were congruent and these 2 segments were congruent. So technically, we could use angle, side at this point to show that the triangles are congruent. We technically didn't even need to go past this point right here. Well, actually, let me back that up. This point right here. We technically didn't even need to go past that point because angle, side already showed that they are congruent. But this proof just took it a few steps further just to show that every angle and every side matches up. So that's definition. I put angles. I should have put definition of congruent triangles. So because every part of both triangles are congruent to each other, that's a definition of congruent triangles. But again, we could have stopped a little bit earlier, or we could have gone about it a different way just to show that they're congruent. You had a lot of options here with this one. All right, so let's do another one. So here again, we're trying to show that these 2 triangles are congruent to each other. So MP bisects NMR. If MP bisects this angle right here, that means it's splitting it up into 2 congruent angles. So that means that this angle is congruent to this angle here. Okay. So actually, let me back up. N is congruent to R. That's given. Okay. So now MP bisects NMR. That is also given. I like to mark off my givens so that I know that I've used them. So that is given. So the definition of angle bisector is that angle NMP is congruent to angle PMR. And that is definition of angle bisector. Okay. So number 4 says the third angles theorem. Well, if you've got two angles in a triangle are congruent to two angles in another triangle, by default, this angle, that's supposed to be 3 lines, is congruent to this angle because the third angle has to be congruent if two angles are already equal. That's the third angle theorem. So we're going to say angle NPM is congruent to angle RPM. That's the third angle theorem. Okay. P is the midpoint of NR. P is the midpoint of NR. That is given. So if P is the midpoint, and I'm running out of room here, that means that this segment is congruent to this segment. That's definition of midpoint. So we are going to say that RP, line segment RP, is congruent to line segment NP. Again, that's definition of midpoint. Then we have that MN is congruent to MR. That's another one of our givens. So let me label that. So MN is congruent to MR, and that's already marked. You can see that was pre-done for us, okay? So MP is congruent to MP. And actually, let me put another mark here just to show they're different. Okay, so this segment right here in this triangle is the same length as this segment and this triangle right here. And that is the reflexive property that tells us that. Okay, that's the reflexive property. And so we have now shown by definition of congruent triangles, because all 3 angles are congruent and all 3 sides are congruent, that these two triangles are congruent to each other. But let's look at it and see if we could have figured it out a little bit quicker than having to do all that, because that's what the whole HL, angle, side, angle, side, that's what that's for, is to keep you from having to do every single side and every single angle. All right, so N was congruent to R. MP bisects, so therefore we figured out that those 2 angles are congruent. So we could have used angle, side, angle here, and we could have stopped right here. And so we could have then said by angle, angle, side, those 2 triangles are congruent. You could have taken a completely different approach if this was just one of those blank proofs and I just said, all right, go somehow show me that these 2 triangles are congruent. You could have also shown that this side, you could have used this side there. You have a lot of options here. So just know that this whole point of this unit is just to show, or this part of the unit is to show that 2 triangles are congruent and that there's a lot of ways of going about it here. Okay.